drunk tourist thought grabbing the Royal Guard's rifle would make a hilarious photo for his mates back home. Come on, just one quick shot, he slurred, reaching out to touch the weapon while his friends filmed everything on their phones. But what he didn't know was that assaulting an armed military guard triggers an immediate professional response trained through years of combat experience. The takedown was swift, decisive, and captured on every camera in the courtyard. What happened next would teach him the most expensive lesson of his life about the difference between liquid courage and criminal assault. Now, before we show you what happened when drunk entitlement met professional military training, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us the worst drunk tourist behavior you've ever witnessed. Now, let's get into it. Tower Bridge, on a Friday evening in late August, was experiencing the kind of controlled chaos that made London summers simultaneously magical and exhausting for anyone trying to maintain order in tourist areas. The combination of extended daylight hours, warm weather, and weekend crowds had created the perfect storm of excitement, alcohol consumption, and poor decision-making that tested the patience and professionalism of everyone responsible for public safety in the area. Standing at his ceremonial post near the Tower of London entrance, Lance Corporal Marcus Williams of the Coldstream Guards represented the intersection of military tradition and modern security challenges that define contemporary ceremonial duties. At 29, Williams had completed 3 operational tours that had taken him from the mountains of Afghanistan to the urban warfare training grounds where British soldiers learned to operate in complex environments where threats could emerge from any direction. His scarlet tunic and bursting cap made him one of London's most photographed individuals. But beneath the ceremonial appearance was a combat veteran whose training encompassed everything from counterinsurgency operations to close-quarters defensive tactics. Williams had been standing at his post for nearly 2 hours, maintaining the perfect military bearing that had made the Queen's Guard legendary, while managing the constant stream of tourists who treated his position as an interactive exhibit rather than a working military assignment. The evening crowd was different from the typical daytime visitors, louder, less inhibited, and significantly more likely to test boundaries that daytime tourists respected instinctively. The nearby pubs and restaurants had been serving alcohol since mid-afternoon, and Williams had already dealt with several individuals whose judgment had been compromised by their consumption. Approaching Williams' position with the swaggering confidence that comes from several pints of beer and peer pressure was Craig Morrison, a 26-year-old construction worker from Glasgow who was in London for his best friend's bachelor party. Morrison had spent the afternoon pub crawling through some of London's most tourist-friendly establishments, consuming enough alcohol to significantly impair his judgment while inflating his confidence to dangerous levels. His group had been documenting their London adventure through a steady stream of social media posts that showed increasingly reckless behavior as their alcohol consumption mounted throughout the day. Morrison's friends had been encouraging him to get a reaction from the guards they had encountered throughout their tour, treating the military personnel like entertainment rather than professional soldiers performing important duties. The group had already been asked to move along from to other locations after their behavior had become disruptive, but rather than moderating their conduct, they had interpreted these warnings as challenges to find more creative ways to provoke responses from people who couldn't defend themselves through normal social channels. What Morrison and his friends didn't understand was that the ceremonial guards weren't defenseless tourist attractions, but active duty soldiers with full legal authority to protect themselves, their equipment, and the locations they were assigned to guard. Williams' rifle wasn't a prop, but a functional weapon, and any attempt to touch or interfere with it would be treated as a serious security threat, requiring immediate intervention. The ceremonial nature of his duties didn't diminish his training or his responsibility to respond appropriately to threats against military personnel or equipment. The area around Williams' post was crowded with evening tourists, many of whom had also been drinking but were managing to maintain appropriate boundaries between entertainment and criminal behavior. Families with children gave Williams' position the respectful space that ceremonial duties required, while couples posed for photos from appropriate distances that acknowledged both the photographic opportunity and the professional nature of his assignment. The contrast between responsible tourist behavior and Morrison's group's escalating recklessness was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone except Morrison himself. Morrison's approach toward Williams' position was being documented by multiple cameras, including his friends' phones, tourist cameras, and the security systems that monitored the area continuously. The convergence of social media documentation and professional security recording meant that whatever happened next would be preserved from multiple angles and perspectives, creating a comprehensive record of both Morrison's behavior and Williams' response that would be available for legal proceedings, military review, and public education about appropriate behavior around military personnel. Williams had been trained to recognize the signs of alcohol impairment and aggressive behavior patterns that often preceded more serious incidents. Morrison's body language, speech patterns, and increasingly bold approach suggested someone whose judgment was significantly compromised and whose behavior was escalating toward potential criminal conduct. The professional assessment Williams was conducting wasn't personal or judgmental. It was tactical evaluation of a developing threat that might require intervention to protect both military assets and public safety. The irony wasn't lost on Williams that his ceremonial posting often required more complex crowd management skills than his combat deployments had demanded. In Afghanistan, threats were typically clear and responses were straightforward, but dealing with intoxicated civilians required balancing military authority with public relations, legal constraints, and the understanding that most inappropriate behavior resulted from poor judgment rather than malicious intent. However, Williams was also trained to recognize when poor judgment crossed the line into criminal behavior that required decisive professional response. But here's what Craig Morrison didn't know about Lance Corporal Marcus Williams. 4 years earlier, Williams wasn't standing in ceremonial dress for tourist photos. He was crouched in a compound in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, with insurgents testing the perimeter defenses and probing for weaknesses that would allow them to breach the security of a forward operating base that housed nearly 200 coalition soldiers, whose lives depended on his ability to identify and neutralize threats before they could cause casualties. Williams had served as a section commander in some of the most contested areas of Afghanistan, where the difference between vigilant threat assessment and casualties was measured in seconds rather than minutes. His training had encompassed not just marksmanship and tactics, but the psychological skills necessary to make split-second decisions about the appropriate level of response to threats that ranged from children throwing stones to suicide bombers attempting to penetrate security perimeters. He had learned to read body language, assess intent, and respond with exactly the appropriate level of force necessary to neutralize threats, while minimizing collateral damage. The close-quarters combat training Williams had received was designed specifically for situations where threats emerged from crowds of civilians, where the difference between innocent bystanders and hostile actors was often impossible to determine until the moment of attack. He had been trained in restraint techniques, pressure point control, and non-lethal takedown methods that could disable threats without causing permanent injury. But he had also been trained to escalate his response immediately if initial techniques proved insufficient to control dangerous situations. During his second deployment, Williams had been responsible for training Afghan military personnel in crowd control and security procedures, experience that had taught him to recognize the behavioral patterns that preceded violent incidents. Intoxicated individuals, whether from alcohol or other substances, followed predictable escalation patterns that experienced security personnel could identify and interrupt before they resulted in serious harm to anyone involved. Williams had learned to distinguish between harmless drunk behavior and genuinely dangerous impairment that posed threats to public safety. But Williams' most relevant experience for dealing with Morrison's approaching assault had occurred during his third deployment, when he had been assigned to a mixed military-civilian facility where coalition forces worked alongside international aid organizations and local contractors. The complex security environment had required constant vigilance and the ability to respond appropriately to threats that could emerge from anyone with access to the facility, including people who were supposed to be allies or neutral parties. It was in this environment that Williams had been forced to physically restrain a contractor who had become violent after consuming alcohol and attempting to gain unauthorized access to restricted areas of the facility. The incident had required Williams to use exactly the kind of measured force that could stop a threat without causing unnecessary injury, while documenting everything thoroughly for the legal and military review processes that followed any use of force by coalition personnel. The training Williams had received in non-lethal control techniques was both comprehensive and regularly updated to ensure that military personnel could respond appropriately to civilian threats without exceeding the legal boundaries that govern the use of force by soldiers operating in complex environments. He understood the legal framework that protected his right to defend military assets and personnel, but he also understood the importance of using only the minimum force necessary to neutralize threats and ensure public safety. Williams' ceremonial posting had actually required additional training specifically focused on crowd control and de-escalation techniques appropriate for tourist environments. The Ministry of Defense understood that ceremonial guards were likely to encounter intoxicated or inappropriate civilian behavior and had developed protocols that balanced military authority with public relations considerations and legal requirements for proportional response to civilian misconduct. What made Williams particularly well-suited for ceremonial duties wasn't just his combat experience, but his demonstrated ability to remain calm under pressure and respond appropriately to various levels of threat without allowing personal emotions or frustrations to influence his professional judgment. His service record showed consistent examples of measured responses to provocative situations, and his commanders had specifically selected him for ceremonial duties because of his ability to represent military professionalism under challenging circumstances, the legal authority that Williams possessed to defend himself and military property was clearly established under British military law and reinforced by civilian legislation that provided enhanced penalties for assault on military personnel. But Williams also understood that his response to any assault would be scrutinized by military superiors, civilian authorities, and the public through social media and traditional media coverage. His training emphasized that professional response wasn't just about stopping threats, but about demonstrating the kind of disciplined competence that reflected well on the military and educated the public about appropriate boundaries and consequences. Morrison's approach toward Williams' position had been building for several minutes, encouraged by his friends' cameras and fueled by alcohol-induced confidence. That made him increasingly bold in testing what he perceived as safe boundaries. He had been making increasingly loud comments about the toy soldiers and their fake weapons, apparently believing that ceremonial duties meant the guards were powerless to respond to civilian harassment or assault. "Watch this, lads," Morrison announced to his friends, loudly enough that other tourists began backing away from what was clearly becoming an inappropriate situation. "I'm going to get a proper photo with this one. Maybe I'll even hold his little gun for the shot." His friends encouraged him with laughter and suggestions for poses, apparently as oblivious as Morrison to the serious legal and safety implications of what he was proposing to attempt, Williams maintained his ceremonial position while conducting the kind of threat assessment that had kept him alive during 3 combat deployments. Morrison's speech was slurred, his movements were uncoordinated, and his decision-making was clearly impaired by alcohol consumption. More importantly, Morrison was showing a kind of escalating aggressive behavior that Williams recognized as preceding violent incidents, and his stated intention to touch military equipment represented a clear threat that required professional response. "Come on then, mate," Morrison said, stepping closer to Williams' position while reaching toward the rifle with obvious intent to grab or touch the weapon. "Just one quick photo. What's the worst that could happen?" But Morrison's question was about to be answered in ways that his alcohol-impaired judgment couldn't anticipate. Because what happened when someone assaulted an armed military guard was precisely what Williams had been trained to prevent through swift, decisive, and professional intervention. The moment Morrison's hand made contact with Williams' rifle, the situation transformed from inappropriate tourist behavior to criminal assault on military personnel and equipment. Williams' response was immediate, professional, and exactly proportional to the threat Morrison had chosen to represent. Using techniques perfected through years of training and combat experience, Williams executed a textbook restraint procedure that neutralized Morrison's threat capability, while minimizing injury to both Morrison and bystanders. The takedown was swift and decisive. Williams used Morrison's forward momentum and intoxicated balance against him, redirecting the assault attempt into a controlled fall that put Morrison face down on the ground, with his arms secured behind his back in a position that prevented further aggressive action, while allowing Williams to maintain complete control of the situation. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds and was captured from multiple angles by the cameras that had been documenting Morrison's approach. Morrison's shock at finding himself restrained on the ground was evident in his confused protests and demands to be released, apparently still not understanding that he had committed a serious crime by assaulting military personnel and attempting to grab a weapon. His friends' laughter had stopped abruptly as they realized that their encouraging Morrison's behavior had resulted in his immediate detention by someone whose authority they had completely misunderstood. Williams maintained his professional composure throughout the incident, using exactly the minimum force necessary to control Morrison while calling for police backup and medical assessment. His training emphasized the importance of preserving evidence, documenting circumstances, and ensuring that any use of force was properly recorded and justified through official channels. Morrison was complaining about his treatment, but Williams could see that the restraint had been applied correctly and that Morrison's discomfort was temporary rather than injurious. Metropolitan Police arrived on the scene within minutes, having been summoned by both Williams' radio call and reports from other security personnel who had witnessed the assault. The responding officers were experienced in dealing with tourist misconduct and immediately understood the legal framework that governed Morrison's situation. Assault on military personnel carried serious penalties under British law, and Morrison's intoxication would not be accepted as mitigation for his criminal behavior. "Sir, you're under arrest for assault on military personnel and attempting to interfere with military equipment," the lead constable announced as Morrison was helped to his feet and formally taken into custody. "You have the right to remain silent, but anything you say may be given in evidence." Morrison's protests about the severity of the charges and his claims that he was just trying to take a photo were noted by the officers, but didn't change the legal reality of his situation. The video evidence captured by multiple cameras would make Morrison's prosecution straightforward, showing clearly that Williams had responded appropriately to an unprovoked assault and had used only the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat and protect military assets. Morrison's friends, who had initially been documenting what they thought would be entertaining harassment of a powerless guard, found themselves providing evidence that would ensure Morrison faced serious legal consequences for his alcohol-fueled poor judgment. Williams returned to his ceremonial position. Once Morrison had been removed from the scene, resuming his duties with the same professional bearing he had maintained throughout the incident. Other tourists, who had witnessed the entire sequence, now approached Williams' post with a new understanding of the professional competence and legal authority that ceremonial duties represented. The incident had served as an education for everyone present about the appropriate boundaries between tourist entertainment and criminal behavior. Later that evening, as Morrison sat in a London police station facing charges that could result in imprisonment and permanent criminal record, Williams completed his ceremonial duties with the quiet satisfaction of having responded professionally to a threat while demonstrating the kind of disciplined competence that reflected well on his training, his regiment, and the military traditions he represented. The incident would be reviewed by military authorities and civilian courts, but Williams was confident that his response had been appropriate, legal, and necessary to protect both military assets and public safety. Would you have expected a drunk tourist assault on a guard to result in immediate takedown and serious criminal charges? Think military personnel should show restraint or respond decisively when physically attacked? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and these conversations matter more than you know. If this story reminded you that alcohol doesn't excuse criminal behavior and that military personnel have the right to defend themselves professionally, hit that like button.